Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story from someone deeply affected by that issue, and finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. This month, we're focusing on drug abuse and addiction, and this week, we're talking about the connection between drug abuse and trafficking in particular. So this week's guest has been on our show twice before. Tonya Folks, Human Trafficking Liaison at the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Tonya, thanks and welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Bob. I've added a hat since I was here last time. I am a couple hats, actually. I'm serving on the Attorney General Yost Human Trafficking Initiative for the state of Ohio. And I'm also now the Chief Operating Officer at Oasis House, who provides direct services to survivors of trafficking.
Well, you're always busy.
I am.
I'll tell you what, that's clear. We'll just say real quick, I kind of alluded to it already. I don't know if you consider this any kind of an honor, but you are the first person to appear on this podcast 3 times.
Yay!
So, yay, that's exciting.
Awesome.
Anyway.
Too bad I look, so bad. But
you brought up some of these issues in 2019, especially when we talked about sex trafficking, but let's delve a little bit more deeply in that connection. Brief overview, right? What's the connection between trafficking and drug addiction and drug abuse?
All right. Well, human trafficking, both sex and labor, is essentially just exploiting someone using force, fraud, or coercion for financial benefit or for benefit that law enforcement can assign a dollar sign to, basically.
Right.
So what that looks like with drug trafficking is, so every year our State Department puts out a report called the Trafficking in Persons Report. We call it the TIP report, and they grade all of the nations, most of the nations in the world, how they're doing on human trafficking, how they're combating it, where their feeder countries are for their labor trafficking victims, things like that. Well, they project that in the top 3 categories where people are labor trafficked, it is drug smuggling. Drug smuggling is one of those. And my first question was, well, how does addiction and drug smuggling tie together? But the way that it ties together is oftentimes when people are addicted, they're more easily manipulated into smuggling drugs for a drug dealer so that they can get their drug of choice.
Right. And that's labor trafficking right there.
And that is labor trafficking because the trafficker is actually using their addiction to coerce them to do it or trick them to do it. They're certainly not paying the minimum wage,
right.
To do it. And then they're bribing them or feeding into that addiction. That definitely, a good prosecutor could prosecute that for labor trafficking.
Right. And then, of course, there are so many other ways, right? People use drugs to get people involved in labor trafficking or sex trafficking in other ways commonly as well, right?
So with sex trafficking, in 2015, we had the first of its kind study come out in America. In countries where prostitution is legal, they have more research. But in 2015, the research that came out showed that women in our country who enter prostitution or sex trafficking, because it's very difficult to tell them apart necessarily, for the first time over the age of 18, 86% of the time, they're drug addicts. And the addiction drives them into the sex industry. Wow. 14% of the time, they do it to make ends meet. So what does that look like? That means that women who are not child victims, who are not necessarily coming from a background of child sexual exploitation, which is the bulk of women who are in the sex industry, choose or trafficked. Now we have a second group out there that we know about of women who the very first time they're sold for sex over the age of 18, they have an addiction issue. So that's the big tie right there. Whether it's trafficking or prostitution, as we've discussed on other podcasts, a lot of times that's very difficult for the observer to see because sex trafficking looks like voluntary prostitution. But very often an addiction issue for women who are in the sex industry over the age of 18 is addiction.
That's fascinating. 86% if you're over 18. Is there a distinction, right, between the trafficker, someone who finds out, oh, this woman is addicted to drugs, I'm going to use that to traffic this woman, versus the woman is on drugs, and because of that, they feel like that's the only way they can come up with the money they need to get the drugs. Is there a distinction between those two ways of getting into the industry?
Yeah. So I think typically what the research shows and what my experience shows is a lot of women who aren't addicted and are being trafficked, they are typically child victims of some kind of trauma, sexual exploitation. They have a paradigm shift. There is a saying in the research, and it's incest is boot camp for sex work.
Wow.
Because what happens is the neural pathways of the brain are affected through the trauma, and they lose the ability to kind of deal and learn coping skills as they're progressing. So then what we will typically see is eventually a trafficker will see that weakness. We know from previous podcasts that prior sex abuse is a huge, easy vulnerability to manipulate. So a sex trafficker will manipulate it, start there. Okay. And then the woman, as she is being sold for sex, the brain, no matter what we call it, legalized, whatever, no matter what you call it, the brain sees it as rape. And we have the MRIs of sex workers' brains to show that the brain sees sex work in most respects as trauma, as if you've been raped. It doesn't matter what we call it. So then those neural pathways are gone, and they don't have any way to cope, and they turn to drugs to kind of numb themselves. Think about it. It is a really gross job. And most women, to do it over and over and over, they start to look for something to help numb that out, just to get them through. And then it becomes more of a habit. So those are women who are not necessarily addicted when they start, but then they eventually become addicted. And then you have women who are already addicted. What we know from the research, that women who are prostitutes or trafficked and they're already addicted, they are being trafficked over the age of 18 for the first time. And this is how we kind of found out about it before the research came out in 2015, what we saw anecdotally. In Dayton, I used to go to drug meetings, coalition meetings, because heroin was awful and it was killing. We were having people die every single day.
Right.
And it was just this epidemic. You could buy a cap of heroin in downtown Dayton for $5.
Wow.
So people were ODing, people were dying. It was awful. So I was going to drug coalition meetings, and this lady from Main Street stood up and she said, "You know what's interesting? I've lived in Dayton my whole life. And about 20 years ago, the bulk of prostitutes, street prostitutes, went away." She said, "I thought it was, Dayton PD and things like that." What she doesn't know is it moved online. It
Right.
didn't necessarily go away, it just moved
Right.
online. So what we know is the women out on the streets, and we know this from state of Ohio research. We went to 5 cities, rounded up women on the street, asked them how they got there. In the majority of cases, they were drug addicts. So most of the women working the street have a drug addiction issue. And she stood up and said that. And then she said, "But the interesting thing is, just recently, I've been seeing women who look, for lack of a better term, beautiful, who are out there, and they don't look like the average street prostitute."
Right.
That's because the average street prostitute was typically a victim of child exploitation and trafficked for many years, sometimes decades before we saw them on the street.
Right.
So what happened is, and then the research came out in 2015 and said these new ladies on the street, a lot of them are coming from suburbs and rural areas, and they get addicted to pain pills, and they move to the inner city to be closer to their drug supply. And they think the only way that they can buy drugs is to sell themselves.
Right.
So they're out there selling themselves on the street, still looking fairly good. Maybe they've been addicted a year or two,
Right.
and they're providing sex services. Some have pimps, some don't, for drug money or for drugs. And the reason that's important to understand is because these ladies didn't know, like most ladies, if you say, "Hey, if you wanted to be a prostitute, where would you go?" And they would say the street. And that's just not how it happens. So what caught this particular lady's eye is these women look like, not like drug addicts, and they're out on the street.
Right.
So we saw an increase of that in Dayton specifically from 15, 16, 17, and then it started dying down in 2018 as people started moving from heroin and fentanyl to methamphetamine and crack and things like that.
So when someone finds themselves addicted to painkillers or whatever, we've talked about that. We have not talked about that before,
Right.
but I've talked about that before. And then that can lead to drug abuse because you're trying to continue to get those pills or something that will take care of that addiction. And then with feeling like they have nowhere else to turn, I guess that's what they might turn to street prostitution. Is there something about the female psyche, if you will, that has them more likely to turn to that than men?
I don't know that it's the psyche. I think it's just simply supply and demand.
Cultural supply and demand situation. Sure.
It's a supply and demand. Sex trafficking boils down to supply and demand. Drug trafficking boils down to supply and demand. When women are addicted, that is kind of the go-to way for
Right.
them to make money. Men, not necessarily, but they can still be exploited. A drug trafficker can exploit them through labor and say, I want you to be the mule. I want you to be the drug smuggler.
Right.
And that's how you can earn your money. Or you can earn your money by, we see dope boys sometimes. They typically don't use, but maybe they do use, and they can earn their drugs by keeping an eye on the trafficker's stable, by being in the organizational structure somewhere where they're helping the trafficker run the women.
Right, exactly. Maybe a quick example, right, of how it is that your trafficker might typically use drugs. Because the assumption is always for the general public that if someone's being prostituted or being sex trafficked, the assumption is that the woman wants to do that for a living. That's what she wants to do, right? You and I, especially, you know that that's not the case. How is it that they typically might use drugs to coerce a woman into that?
Well, there's lots of different
So many
scenarios,
ways.
so I'll just give
Right.
you one. A woman may be desperate. She may be coming from a past of abuse. Let's just assume that there's a vulnerability in her life that has been spotted by a trafficker. If she's not using and they use that vulnerability to recruit her and groom her and season her and get her on board, a lot of times that first encounter with a customer is going to be really scary because your internal alarm system as a woman is going to be flying. You
Right.
don't know this person, you're going to a strange place, or they're coming to you and you're scared. Well, what can you do? Oh, I'll just have a drink. I'll just have a couple shots of tequila and we'll call it good, right? But over time, you need more and more. And the trafficker freely provides that. I'll get it for you. Don't worry. It's all part of the business or something like that. And then he sees that she's getting addicted, but he doesn't care because it just makes it easier because then he doesn't have to use the psychological stuff. He can just dangle the drugs. You go to the date, I'll give you a taste before the date. And then after the date, you can get more, that kind of thing. So if she's not addicted, it might look something like that. We have stories. We had a young lady who was trafficked out of her parents' house many years ago. Basically, she became friends with a new girl in school. The new girl was giving her expensive gifts. Mom and dad, she came from a good family. They didn't like it, but they didn't follow through with saying, don't take that new iPod. This is when iPods were new, all right, or expensive. And what ended up happening was she was sneaking out to go to parties with this young lady, and she thought she was just smoking pot, but they were putting more than that into it. And that's not an urban legend. She used to go around and talk about this. She got addicted, didn't even know it. All she knew is that when she didn't sneak out and go out with her friends, she felt very sick. So after she got really dope sick, her friend said, I've got medicine for you, but you got to sneak out and basically turn a trick, which sitting here as adults, we're like, what? But she did it because she didn't want to be sick. So her parents started to notice things like she was missing school. She was tired all the time. They thought it was a boy. Shortly after that, she ran away. And she called them later and she said, you know, I'm a heroin addict and they gave me heroin and I was turning tricks every night. And that's why I had to run away because I couldn't hide it anymore. In her case, they used drugs that she didn't agree to take, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So things like that, I mean, it really is an individual kind of thing. Drugs makes it It just makes it so easy. I had a woman that I was working with so the average woman who's being trafficked, the research shows, will exit and re-enter the life 7 times before she breaks free. And it all goes back to that neurological complication she has from the trauma. But this particular woman said that there was a dope boy on her street, and every time she tried to get clean, he would walk past her house and throw a cap of heroin in a little baggie in her yard because it was $5. It cost him nothing. She was both insulted and afraid that she would, one more time fall off the wagon or whatever. So what she did is she gave law enforcement her phone with all the dope boys in it, like all their phone numbers, so that the task force could potentially call them, make it buy and things like
Right.
that. But she was like, please arrest him because he just goes by. Now, he wasn't the actual trafficker. He just kind of worked for the trafficker.
Right. Trying to get people addicted or keep them addicted so they can continue to traffic. So you wanted to talk a little bit about something else about the uniqueness of the female brain or something like that?
Well, it's not the female brain. So what we know from the research is women who get addicted tend to come from a different place than men who become addicted. The research that I've read on men and addiction in Ohio specifically, a lot of men who become addicted got addicted because they had an injury. They were treated with Oxycontin or some kind of drug that they got addicted to, and then the doctor cut it off. So then they went to the street because they still had the pain. Okay, here's the problem right now. I'm just going to throw this in there as well.
Okay.
Right now, because Ohio has a lawsuit, a bunch of all these drug companies are being sued, doctors are being sued. We're having a really unintended consequence of that. I'm meeting people who have legitimate lifelong pain that was being managed adequately with their doctor's supervision, but those doctors stopped prescribing because they don't want to get sued.
Wow. Yeah.
So now they're giving them things for chronic pain. They're giving things like Suboxone, which does really not a lot for pain.
Right.
But you still have to be weaned, but they're so afraid now. So the unintended consequences, we have a bunch of people out there who have legitimate long-term chronic pain issues that were being managed well. And now they can't. So now these people, what do they have? What can they do?
Right.
They have to buy pills or live in pain. So we really I understand there was overprescribing. I'm not disagreeing with that. But I think we've gone way too far in the opposite direction now. And I meet men who've had chronic pain, managed it for decades with professional help, who are now getting nothing. And they're looking.
Right.
They're looking.
Whatever they can do to try to find something to help the pain.
And none of that's regulated. None of that. I mean, if you're under a doctor's supervision, in my opinion, and it's been successfully managed, I just don't think they should be threatened with being sued. It's not, but that's just my opinion. So, but with women, what we see typically, women who get addicted, they're not necessarily doing it after an injury. Are they out there? Yeah, but they're actually a minority. When you work with women who have addiction issues, you see very clearly that the addiction actually springs from some other kind of almost relational or emotional abuse, sexual abuse issue. There's that underlying trauma, which is why when women who come to Oasis House, we get them trauma-informed care. They see trauma therapists because if they have a substance abuse issue, they're never going to really be to a place where they're done until they deal with that prior issue. But we don't see that with men as much. Some we do. So men tend to come from a place of prescription medication. Women tend to come from a place of self-numbing to get through the day, to get over this past trauma. So when a trafficker meets a woman who's already addicted, they know intuitively, okay, I don't have to do much here
Right.
because she's got big issues and this is how she copes. So we do see a difference between men and women. And then there's the supply and demand business side of sex trafficking, which is why women can make money. I'm not saying men can't make money. We know, for instance, out in Washington State, there are blocks and blocks of runaway teens and homeless youth, and they call that the kiddie stroll. Well, some of those kids are boys.
Right.
Typically, what we see in this area in Southwest Ohio is women primarily being trafficked. And then they either started with a drug habit or they moved to drugs at some point to deal with the life.
Right. Well, can we talk a little bit about what can the normal person in the pew do to help stem this problem that we have in
Well,
society today?
it's so interesting you asked that, just because our executive director at Oasis House, her name is Donna Pierce, and she is a very devout Catholic, and she believes in all of the Catholic principles and service. And so I've had these conversations with her. She kind of asked kind of what you just did, like how can we be hands and feet? The biggest thing is I guess you have two areas. You have women who are addicted, who aren't necessarily being trafficked, but I'll address women who are addicted and are being trafficked.
Okay.
We have a lot of sober living. I don't know if you're aware, but in the state of Ohio, Ohio Medicaid will cover residential drug treatment for adults. They cover it. So there's no excuse, right? Unless they're just not ready, but they'll cover it and a woman can go to residential treatment. What often happens is when they leave residential treatment, they go to a sober living house, or sometimes they come to Oasis if they've got that kind of history, and they kind of get on their feet. I think anyone who would want to be involved could volunteer
Right.
at organizations like Oasis to be mentors, because typically they'll get a sponsor, but we give them adult women who are mentors, who are kind of like big sisters. And it just reminds them, they have a constant reminder through their mentor that the world isn't the drug world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's all they see.
It
That's all they
is.
see.
And some of them grew up with it. I worked with a girl whose dad shot her up with heroin when she was 11. When I entered her life, she was 30, and she'd never even had 6 months in her life sober.
Wow.
And she was trafficked from 11 on. So unfortunately, she didn't make it. She didn't make it. I know all organizations say this, but when it comes to this issue, and I'm not sure why, but a lot of people don't want to necessarily give. I know Oasis House, I know other organizations in Ohio who serve this population need donations. We're faith-based, so we haven't applied for federal grants and things like that. We look to our faith community to be our mentors, our supporters, our donors. We're going to be having a human trafficking conference in January for Southwest Ohio. We're going to have a lot of exciting new speakers, and your listeners can get involved that way. They can say, hey, I'm not sure how I can be hands and feet, but they could come to a conference, learn more about the issue, and think, oh, you know what? I'm in advertising. I could potentially do this or do that. I tell people it doesn't matter what job you have, you can be an abolitionist, but it takes some talking, right? It takes some learning the issue
Right.
and talking.
Right. So we could show the website real quick. I'm going to share the screen. Oasisforwomen.org, right? That's how you find it. Oasisforwomen.org. There at the top, if you're only listening on the podcast, there's a donate button. There's also a volunteer button.
Mm-hmm.
So that's two
And you
ways.
don't have to be in Dayton. We have 2 houses, but a lot of our services, a lot of our women are in the community because they have children or dogs. They can't live in our houses if they got dogs. But we do all kinds of things all over Southwest Ohio as far as education and talking and partnering with churches. We support other organizations, especially organizations that serve females. So a lot of substance abuse organizations that have women's programs, we support them. We can be a resource for them. Yeah, Oasis is a really great nonprofit. It really is.
So you know a lot about that one because you
I do.
work there now, or
Yeah.
you serve there now.
I do.
Is there something besides Oasis House you want to point people to?
So yeah, if you're in the Cincinnati area, you can check with the Salvation Army, but I will tell you that there are several churches that have human trafficking ministries. You could probably start with your own church and ask them if they know of those churches. I used to keep a list, but then their ministry will change or whatever. But I know some of the bigger churches down there are really involved. They do street outreach, they do food drives, things like that.
So check with your local church as well. That would be another good way. You mentioned Salvation Army. Salvation Army places have specific.
In Ohio, I don't know how it is in the rest of the states, but both Cincinnati and Columbus, our Salvation Armies have been given federal grant dollars to really kind of lead the human trafficking initiative in their areas. Now, Cincinnati has some growing to do, and the arm of their human trafficking of the Salvation Army is called End Slavery. So if you're in Cincinnati and you need help with resources, you know someone, or you just want to be educated, so you have that information ready, you can contact End Slavery, and that is through the Salvation Army. And then also in Columbus. Ohio's really in front of the curve on this, all the way to Toledo. From Toledo to Cincinnati, we've got most of the state covered, except what we call the Appalachian counties, which are southeast Ohio.
Right.
But we had a woman who started a nonprofit called Eyes Up Appalachia. Her name is Christy Bartman, and she's amazing. And she's got that area. She's building it to be covered. Once that's up and it's fully covered, all of Ohio pretty much will be covered.
Right. So the big counties, Franklin, Hamilton, Montgomery, Cuyahoga. How do you pronounce
Cuyahoga? Yeah.
Cuyahoga.
Yeah. And our Attorney General, Yost, he is a rare politician, meaning when he says something, he gets it done.
Right.
And it's fast. It is amazing. I'm on the Human Trafficking Initiative. I'm in subcommittees. I work with some amazing organizations. There's an organization that is faith-based called Rahab, and it is in Northern Ohio. Amazing organization to support. Every benchmark he sets, we meet it and he meets it, and it's amazing. Last time we talked, Bob, we talked about how it was a misdemeanor to buy sex in Ohio. And he recently helped push legislation through. Last month, two big things changed. It is now a fifth degree felony to purchase sex. And we had sex trafficking defined legally through the federal government is anyone under 18 cannot consent to be in the sex industry. They're a victim of sex trafficking. But in Ohio, our language didn't match that. So a 16 or 17-year-old girl that shows up at a sting and gets arrested, a lot of times she'd just go to jail.
Right.
Even though that doesn't make sense, because that's child sex abuse, right?
Right. You told me that story that last time we talked about that.
Well, AG Yost spearheaded it and got the legislation through. They passed it. It's law. We now match the federal law. That's two huge things that died in committee before.
Wow.
One of the biggest lessons I've learned since working with this population is a lot of the preconceived ideas I had preconceived ideas about prostitution, which the research and experience proved me wrong.
I certainly did before I spoke with you the first time as well. Right.
And I also had preconceived ideas about the type of woman who gets addicted. And then after working with this population, that just blows it out of the water. You can be a high functioning, super successful person who still has something that you are going to eventually self-medicate over. They come from every walk of life. They come from every socioeconomic background. And it was really eye-opening for me to see, as a believer, they're wounded. And what do you do with the wounded? You help them. And it's hard because they do fall back into it because they develop habits sometimes. Not all of them, but maybe they develop a habit of lying and manipulating and stealing. Those are very difficult things to break, even sober. So they're almost learning to live as a human all over again. But in the course of that, the people who's helping them, we got to have a lot of grace, because if we don't, when they steal or when they lie or when they manipulate, we wouldn't be in it very long.
Right.
So if you know that going in, you do what you can to mitigate it. And then you just, that's the business that we're kind of in. And I just give them grace, but not enabling. That's a fine line, because sometimes you love them so much, or I do, that I want to do the work for them. But I always tell them, I can't want this for you more than you want it for yourself, right?
Right.
Here's something else your viewers can do or your listeners can do.
Yes.
If you know someone who's addicted and they need residential treatment, do your due diligence. Not every residential drug treatment center is good. Sorry, I said it out loud. Let me tell you what to look for. When that person leaves, do they continue with that person's case management? Do they continue supporting that person in maybe some kind of outside group? Do they continue helping that person in every way except providing the bed? If they don't, find one that will, because you're going to pay the same, right? Or the state's
Right.
going to pay for it. So make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck, which sounds a little weird saying that for a drug treatment facility.
Right. So these are questions you can easily ask. We were thinking about, bringing a friend or something to a rehab center or going yourself, perhaps even. You can
Right.
ask these questions up front. What kind of follow-up do you have? What happens when I walk out of the doors here? These are important questions to ask. To make
Who's going to be my support network? Are you going to help me set that up? Are you going to help me find a place to live? What's your recidivism rate? What are you looking at for people who come back into your program? How soon do they come back in? That kind of thing. Because
Right.
for women, typically, if it's a program that doesn't have a trauma-informed therapist on staff to deal with that underlying trauma, you probably don't want to go there. Now, most addicts don't think they have underlying trauma until they get into treatment and they realize it. But if you're in a program that doesn't have a therapist and you realize it, then what?
Right.
So if you're female and you're an addict, you know in the dead of night what you're covering. Find a place that can help you with that.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for sharing with us about the connection between drug abuse and trafficking today, and even how we can get involved in ridding this horrible practice in our communities. You mentioned Oasis House, Salvation Army, and other ways that we can also put on our website, as always, at www.catholicaoc.org/beingprolife. We'll put those links on that page as well. But Tonya, thank you again for spending time with us today.
Thank you for having me, Bob. It was my pleasure.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website to check out the video version of this podcast or the links talked about at www.catholicaoc.org/beingprolife. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to being with you next time.